Well, hello, good evening. This is Liam O'Mara,
And hi, I'm Melissa Bourbonnais.
and this is our new show, Cancelled, where we're going to talk about a lot of really thorny, hot button, sort of controversial issues that people are always arguing about, and try to do it in a very civil way. And try to keep this sort of open and conversational. And I figured for a start to introduce you to our new show, we should start by I don't know, introducing ourselves and why you should even be watching this, and why we decided to do this show together. So, Melissa, why are you doing this thing with me?
I was excited to join this project with you, Liam, because for all of our differences, we believe in some basic fundamentals. We believe in some important things, and we understand that diversity of thought is important. And we understand that civic discourse is really one of the only paths to compromise and to solution. I know we both share a heart for the greater good. And I think it's time someone, somewhere, models healthy civic discourse. And that's what I know we're going to do. So I'm excited to be here.
That's a nice way to put it there, in the sense of, I guess, modeling good civic discourse. This is something that honestly frustrates the holy hell out of me with a lot of people trying to shut each other out with, say, like accusations of virtue signaling or that sort of thing, when I don't know, having good social role models is kind of important. It's something we've always done, and we don't see a lot of it because so much of our major media is it's sensationalized. It's trying to get people really angry in order to keep them focused and sell the ads to them. It's a business, right? And that just keeps everyone super angry, but it stops you from talking to anyone else. It just creates tons of different echo chambers. This is something
Yeah,
that's, it's long frustrated me, and I think it frustrates you too. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And it may serve kind of some immediate purpose. It certainly does news outlets well with clicks and views and the drama and the sensation that keeps people upset and angry and sharing, right? Continuing to share those videos online and to engage. So it maybe it accomplishes that immediate purpose that benefits the news outlets. And I think sometimes it accomplishes the goals of the politicians to keep their base active and engaged and those donations coming in and to maintain their seat or their position. But in the interim, what happens is that we lose, like we the people lose. And it isn't long term, it isn't good for civic health, it isn't good for our country, it's counterproductive. And I know that we share again the goal of maybe trying to affect some change on that end. For if we want government to be really for the people and to represent us, then we have to engage in something different. And I think it starts with respectful disagreements and meaningful
Yeah.
discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, honestly, that sense, and you kind of hit it when you're mentioning that it does serve the goals of the politicians frequently as well as the media, because they want to keep the donations pouring in and they want to keep people excited enough to come back out and vote for candidate X, candidate Y, whatever. And oftentimes without actually having to do anything for us. You can talk a good talk on the campaign trail, but at the end of the day, they're not even trying on a lot of issues here, because really to try to get things done, and this is something that people in our Congress used to understand, you did have to have big conversations. You did have to have public debates. You did have to solicit public opinions. You had to be willing to engage there, and they don't anymore. Honestly, though, this is sort of interesting because the whole filibuster has been in the news a lot, like the problems with it. But honestly, what we have currently today isn't even a filibuster properly. It's basically just a way of stopping any discussion from even happening. It just there's no discussion at all. Frequently, the job of the whip now in Congress is to go around and see, hey, are there enough votes to already pass this thing? Oh, cool. Then we'll bring it to the floor. And if there
Right.
aren't, they don't even bother to introduce the legislation, which means there's never any public discussion, to say nothing of the actual politicians having to articulate their reasons for it. We don't get that anymore.
Well, and even of course, I agree, and it's so lazy. Like it's just ultimately so lazy
It
because
is.
even though I mean, we could go back and forth and debate the filibuster, right? And I think there's decent arguments on both sides about the value of the filibuster, especially specific to the minority party. But once upon a time, when you utilize the filibuster, like you really had to go through the motions of exerting that energy. Like you had to stand up at the podium and you had to go on, and maybe we could critique whether it made any sense because you didn't have to necessarily talk about the bill, and we know that. And the filibuster is notorious, right? The politicians that have utilized it historically are notorious for reading from the Bible or reading from the phone book. Or I think we all know that you don't have to stick to the topic, but the point is when politicians would utilize the filibuster, however they did it, they would have to get up, they would get behind that podium, and hour after hour after hour, they would have to go through some type of communication, some
They
type
had
of
to work.
discourse. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. In a nutshell, they had to work. And now we don't see that. Really, we don't see that on practically any level of government, especially if we're looking at Congress. And to go back to what you said just a minute ago, when we're stuck in this kind of divisive, the two sides, this what amounts to demonizing the opposing party, that's a state we've been in. We seem to be getting worse instead of better. And it goes back to what you said. The politicians then that hold those positions, they don't have to work. The only thing they have to do is ensure that the other side is evil and scary, right? As long as they ensure that the other side is the bad guy, is the enemy, is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to this country, then by default they keep their position. And
And
that's
for
so
plenty of people, it seems that's the main goal, really, is to stay there year after year, regardless of whether you're really doing anything. I think the filibuster was sort of a fun, like, accidental example there. And I like that you mentioned that people did have to get it there, and even if they were just reading from the phone book, they were still doing something. But even when they were doing that, even when they weren't as they used to, getting up there and like actually fulminating on the issue itself. Even if they're just wasting time, the point of that is it's a delaying tactic that causes other people to continue to discuss the bill, to try and find that compromise that'll let you go forward and do something. It was intended as a parliamentary delaying tactic. And we've turned it into a way to just shut down any discussion at all. And I think it's honestly almost a metaphor for the entire way we approach politics in the society is to shut out conversation. I think one of the things that comes up for me a lot, and I know I get this a lot when people are like, well, why would you have those conversations? Why are you even doing that? Because they tend to think that if you're talking to someone you disagree with, or you're talking to someone that you have, say that even if it's only a handful of issues, but if you've got this issue, it's like, oh my God, how can you talk to this person who believes that? And the issue for me is talking to someone does not agree with them, and it is not normalizing their view. It gives you an opportunity to actually engage and understand, why do they believe this, and how can we figure out a way forward here if they do believe this? Because if somebody has a genuinely awful view and you completely cut them out, what are they going to do? They start looking for other people who only agree with them. And those ideas get worse. It creates a feedback loop. And they're all just reinforcing each other. And this is why so much of our discussions, whether it's around the water cooler at work or online, have become such echo chambers, and it becomes so much more toxic and vitriolic. And you get, a lot of that straight up demonization. I mean, hell, I had this a lot with, during my brief foray into politics. I try to make the point a lot to Democrats that we have to talk to Trump supporters because there's a lot of them here. And if you just shut them out, Trump supporter bad, Trump supporter racist, and you can't talk to them, then how do you solve the problem? How does things get better? If you leave them alone, then they're just going to get more and more racist, or whatever drove them into it in the first place, because they're only going to talk to people who already agree with them. It doesn't help us.
Yeah, it doesn't help us on any level, because first of all, if you are stuck in this echo chamber, how do you even know your position really? If you're not aware, you can listen to anyone else and you're not aware of any other perspective, then how do you know that what you think is really the best anyway, or what you think is really your ultimate conclusion if you're not
Right.
taking in different perspectives, you're not considering different perspectives. So really, in the name of just kind of education and the idea that knowledge is power, we should be contemplating different perspectives. And oftentimes, particularly as an educator, I've moderated student discussions, and I've had students change my perspective just by virtue of, wow, I never even thought of it that way. I never even considered that. How can you consider a different perspective when you're just stuck in this echo chamber? So you have to, or you should anyway, in the name of just knowledge and education, you should want to have that exchange and be certain of your position, whatever that happens to be, that it's ultimately an informed position. And it's not informed when it's singular. And it's not informed
Right.
when it's the same voice of everybody else, or when it's just this echo chamber, or everyone is saying the same thing. And then on top of that, even if you come to this conclusion, so say you're open-minded for a minute, right? And you take in different perspectives and you come to the conclusion that you stand here on this position or there on that position. Okay, well, that's fine. I can respect that. But now the next order of business as a democracy is that we have to figure out with a compromise. We have to come up with a compromise. And I can respect your views if they're different than mine, and you can respect mine as well if they're different from yours. But in this country, within a democracy where we are to live together and work together and share the same programs and institutions and amenities and so forth, then we need to come up with a middle ground and some kind of compromise. And you don't get to just say, well, you're wrong, and so see you later, and too bad. And likewise, I don't get to say the same thing to you. So part of what these diverse perspectives, why they matter, and why discussing them and contemplating them, why it's important, is because if we're looking to serve the greater good, then we're going to have to find compromise in that, because we're not all the same. And the whole idea of diversity, we embrace that as a country, and the whole idea of diversity, going right back to Brown versus Board of Education, and why the Supreme Court struck down this literal interpretation of the Constitution that separate but equal isn't constitutional, or that's what they struck down, the separate but equal doctrine. And they focused on in that decision how important diversity is. And we'll all say off the cuff that, yeah, it's important, yeah, it matters, but we need to live it out in diverse perspectives and conversations and find some sort of compromise between the two sides, or the various sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ends up being where a lot of people have problems with these discussions at all, where they're unwilling to do it, because they'll look at someone and say, oh my gosh, your views are practically neo-Nazi. How could I possibly talk to you? Because, the midway point between me and a Nazi is still pretty freaking bad. Right? And it's often hard for people to imagine, why would you even have those conversations? But at the end of the day, I think what they're missing is that while a lot of the political ideologies or policies are horrific, frequently the people are not. Frequently the people just don't really... I mean, I've run into so many people that when you actually spend the time working with them to try and figure out what they really believe, you find out that they have basically libertarian views, or they're center left or something, and they were like just supporting Trump or the Republicans or whatever because of a particular issue. They weren't thinking of it enough holistically, about what all their positions were. And we're just sort of like lumping them all together. Yes, there are some genuinely awful people who supported
Right.
Trump. Not everyone who supported Trump is. They frequently are okay with a few awful things, but that doesn't mean you can't have those conversations. And that's honestly how things improve anyway. It's why this country has gotten so much better over the time that we've been around anyway. We are obviously a lot less horrific and violent and vicious and racist and sexist than we used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Absolutely.
got there because we engaged. So I think you're hitting two different things that I think both interest me here. One is this question of self-awareness about what we believe, which I find honestly is deeply lacking in most people, most citizens, most voters. And it's true even among college students. I mean, I'll have people that come in and take my classes, and they honestly, they identify with a party or a label. They're like, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, Democrat, whatever. They have a thing, right? But they don't really know what they truly believe or why. They only have a handful of issues that have stood out to them over time. And it gives them a neat little box, and they stop there. Mm-hmm. But when you actually work with them and help them identify what their ideologies are, it's so much more complex. And it opens up a lot of spaces for discussion there. And I think that if more of us really were aware of the range within the two parties, within the major ideologies too. Mm-hmm. Liberals, massive range of perspectives there. Conservatives, massive range of perspectives. Leftists, rightists, whatever. Libertarians, huge diversity of ideas. But we lump everything into nice, neat little boxes and shut it out. And that lack of self-awareness really gets to me. The other one that you brought up, though, I think is a good sort of segue to saying something to the people who are tuning in about who we are. Because, yeah, we actually both do teach a bit of political philosophy and politics and whatnot in history. So, I mean, I don't know. So tell the viewers something about what you do.
I am currently in law enforcement. I work for the Sheriff's Department. Prior to that, I taught American government classes or political science classes, but primarily American government. I have taught on and off for about 15 years, and sometimes at the university, sometimes at the community college, and now it just depends on where I can fit the classes into my schedule or if I can fit the classes into my schedule. But in my experience teaching, and I loved my job in law enforcement, but I spent quite a few years in education. And one of the things that I loved about teaching was seeing those light bulbs go off when students would figure things out, when they'd make connections, and when they would learn really what was behind those talking points, right? Those political talking points that they picked up maybe from their parents or at church or some political show that they would tune into. And so when they understood kind of what was behind it and became more informed and understood the bigger picture, it was always fantastic to see those light bulbs go off and see those connections be made. And one of the ways that I always approached my classes, I tried really as a political science professor to be neutral. I didn't want to go in there and make, right, contrary to all the rhetoric about indoctrinating our students, I didn't go in there looking to make Republicans or Democrats. And I really personally didn't have any stake in it. And I didn't really care if they registered or what they registered as or anything like that. It was really about my students being informed. But I would approach it from this standpoint, and I think this is probably what we're lacking as a whole. I would let students know that, hey, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, at the end of the day, they tend to want the same things, right? When you take the issue of gun control, Republicans feel one way, Democrats feel the polar opposite. They're both coming from the perspective of public safety. Okay, they want safe streets. They want for us to be safe in our homes. They want for us to be able to go to college, go to work, go wherever and be safe. So for Democrats, of course, they feel as if their position is taking guns off the street and having strict gun control or gun regulation tends to be the answer. That's their perspective in general terms. Republicans feel as if it's the opposite, where if we're strong on gun ownership rights and everybody has the right to protect themselves and everybody can carry, then that's our best means of public safety. For the most part, though, right, what do we want? We want to be safe, right? We want to be safe in our homes. We want our families to be safe. And most of us, we don't want to see harm inflicted on anybody, right? We don't want to see our neighbors, our friends, our community members, whoever, to be subject to any kind of harm. So the intention is the same, but they're coming about it from different perspectives. If you can kind of go in understanding that, and I think it speaks to what you said about, right, just because they're a Trump supporter doesn't mean that they're fundamentally horrible people. So if you can kind of go in with the mindset that for the most part, we want the same things, right? We want to be healthy and to prosper and for our families to be safe and for us to be able to work and pay the bills and, I don't know, retire at 60 or something like that and travel around in our RV or whatever our goals are. I mean, for the most part, we all want those similar types of goals. And And I think the parties, I mean, for the most part, in terms of ideology, the parties want those things for us too. They just have very, very different approaches in securing that or in establishing that. And so
Right.
we need to examine those different ideals and find some kind of approach that, right, that we can hopefully achieve it and make both sides happy, I guess, in the interim.
Yeah, and I've brought that up in a number of classes over the years, trying to get people to think about, well, you're kind of pointing out that we all kind of want the same things. Everyone wants the best for their kids. They want to, I don't know, live, have food, pay the rent, whatever. I mean, we generally have very similar goals, but we often have very different means of getting there. And oftentimes those means, they can come from different places. Some of it comes from particular ideological training, particular influences that can shape a particular perspective, and you've just never considered it another way. So you don't know that there are other ways to achieve that goal, maybe ways that might work better, who knows? But you're simply never exposed to it. And from the other, there's oftentimes simply a different morality. There's a different fundamental wiring that you're starting with. And what people often do is they assume that the other side are somehow immoral or bad people, but they're wired with a predisposition for a different type of morality. So different arguments work on them. If you, I've often found it, and a lot of the evolutionary psychology and the political psychology bears this out, if you take exactly the same idea and you frame it differently, if you put it in the moral language that appeals to the other side, then you get their attention. So I mean, and there's a whole range of different ways to do this, and people often they worry about that. Well, that seems dishonest. You're like, oh, you're just changing what you believe, and you're not, because your principle is the same, your belief is the same, your policy is the same, but you're using the right kind of language that helps reach people where they are, and I think we don't do enough of that. We don't reframe our arguments to appeal to a wider audience. We just assume if they don't understand me, they're dumb.
Or they're horrible, or they're selfish,
yeah,
or
they're
they're
horrible.
corrupt, or
Exactly.
right,
Yeah.
or any other disparaging comment that is
Right.
easy. It's so much easier to just say, "Oh well, Liam, okay, you're a dirtbag, and I don't want to have anything to do with you," right?
Right.
But that goes back to the echo chamber, and that's not. It's counterproductive, and it's not how we get better. It's never how we've been able to get better as a country.
Yeah, it really isn't, and it's one of the reasons that throughout my life I have tried to stay focused much more on the ideas anyway. So I can point out that idea has corrupt consequences. It does a particular thing. It has a harmful effect. This particular policy is problematic, but the person, right, or their belief or their morality isn't the problem. It's the specific set of ideas you're dealing with. I don't know, this is something we often try to teach children, and it's amazing how many lessons we teach little kids and then completely forget in adulthood. Remember all the kindergarten stuff about, oh, you should share with Johnny, don't want to hoard all the stuff, and then as soon as you're an adult, yeah, fuck Johnny, take everything. We just completely change and forget all those kindergarten lessons. But I think there's a really good one in this, in that we really should, I don't know, it's like we assume that because somebody has this particular idea, they grew up a certain way, they have a particular belief or whatever, that they must be a bad person just because of that. Well, the idea can be bad. The idea can absolutely be horrible, but if you approach the person a little bit with a bit more equanimity, you can help them to see why the idea is, oh no, look, if we take this to its logical conclusion, this bad thing happens and it hurts a lot of people. Oh, okay. And then we can actually make some progress there. But if you just shut the person out as if the person was the same as the idea,
right?
And again, we used to teach kids that, talk about their arguments, don't talk about them, and we seem to completely toss that in politics.
Yeah, and the echo chambers, and even of course the council culture, which is maybe a few notches past the echo chamber thing, it makes it easy to do that. It's difficult, like if you and I are friends, right? And we have this mutual respect and we're friends. And so we can still disagree, but it's difficult to cancel someone, to hate somebody when there's that rapport there, and there's that mutual respect, when there's that rapport, and when we really have gotten to know each other. It's not that it's impossible, but it just makes it more challenging. On the conversely, if we just stick to our echo chambers and just the people that think like us, and we always talk, kind of singing to the choir, so to speak, to the people who agree with us, then the enemy, right? Then that other person who is just maybe representative of a different view, but then that enemy, that person over there who has the MAGA hat on, or whatever little anecdote you want to use, then it's easy, right? It's easy to kind of hate them, and it's easy to see them as the enemy, and it's easy to want to have nothing to do with them. And now I'm just repeating myself, but it doesn't get us anywhere. And even
right.
and the funny thing is, sometimes what I'll tell some of my students or my friends or whoever I'm having a conversation with, sometimes I'll say, even let's discuss this and try to find some kind of compromise and solution, if only for our own best personal interest. So even if I really don't like you and I really don't want to hang out with you, right? I mean, then it's still ultimately, if I'm looking at it from my own personal self-interest, it's still ultimately better that we come up with solutions and progress and improve, as opposed to, okay, I hate you, so I'm going to be stuck with this shitty system that isn't good for anybody. Like, right. Logically, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make anything any better. And we tend to think that it can. We can, if we just shut the stuff out, that it goes away. But that's another thing that we tried to teach small children. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away, Bobby. Right. But then we forget that completely as adults. We just toss it out. I'll say about a little bit more about this in just a second here. But you brought up an interesting point there that just sort of sticks with me. The whole engaging with people. I do a lot of. I study a lot of extremist political ideologies professionally. So I've studied Nazism and fascism and Stalinism and all this horrifying crap. And I've had to study really nationalism and racism and all these horrifying ideas, because I'm sort of fascinated by the psychology, what draws people into them, the way that they sort of fill a kind of emotional void or whatever. And and obviously they have very destructive consequences. So we have a good reason to want to understand them and how to deal with them when they come up. But there's occasional really interesting projects that show up along the way. There was a fellow that, and I'm totally blanking on his name. It frustrates me. So many of my books are still all boxed up. But so I've got this. It was a fellow that. This black gentleman basically went and started hanging out with Klansmen, like literal white supremacists, not the people who are in denial about being Klansmen, like a lot of people are in this country, but the people who still put on their stupid white hoods, went and hung out with them and talked to them. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, he pulled a lot of them out of extremism. Mm-hmm. And got them to start moderating their positions as they came to accept him as a person, and that became a bridge for them to overcome the hate programming that they'd grown up with. Because many people who get into those kind of extremes, they're from very homogenous areas anyway, and they're simply never exposed to those differences. They never talk about it. It's easy to believe anything about somebody if you're never around it. And here they're saying wow, you're a genuinely cool person, and oh, maybe I'm wrong about this. And
exposure, diversity, exactly. Education, all those things that on paper we know are so good for us.
Exactly. And honestly, we have this weird division in this country too. People are always talking about the whole red states, blue states, or red areas, blue areas, or whatever. And if you look at the map, it's frequently the urban areas are pretty blue. Even in the deep south, if you look at the big cities in the deep south, they're all pretty solidly blue. Right? I mean, that's true anywhere. And it's not even people think, it's not minority populations or diversity or themselves that do it. It's simply the fact that the larger population gets, the more diversity is going to show up just as a natural consequence. Mm-hmm. No matter what the sources of it are. If a larger group is going to have more outliers and more differences in it, and you're going to interact with them more. You're going to learn from them more, and you're going to learn, he's not scary. So they become naturally more cosmopolitan areas, more tolerant areas. It's not schools or politics or something that's like programming and brainwashing people to make them liberals. They become more liberal when they're exposed to different ideas. It's just a natural process. And the more we actually talk to each other, the easier that is. The more we accept the diversity of ideas, the range of ideas that we have, and we come to the table and talk about it, the more it helps to breed an overall tolerance just in general. And I think we tend to forget that too. The people who often talk the most and preach the most about tolerance and diversity and being liberals or whatever, they can be just as intolerant by shutting themselves off and self-selecting into groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And what it does, I think, what you're referring to about the gentleman that infiltrated, really, I guess, the black guy that infiltrated the Klan, right?
Yeah,
when
I've
was
got to look
that?
the name up. I've got to look the name up because it's driving me nuts. I can't remember this. I mean, I just read this book a couple of years ago.
We'll have to follow up with that. But because when you do something like that, and whatever it is that's different about you or different about that other person, it's what happens is it's harder to, you can't ignore now the human element that's there, right? Now there's a human element that's there with the person that you're talking with, versus if you take that guy that you're referring to out of the equation or out of the Klan circle, then all they have is their hate. All they have is their ideas. All they have is that repetition of why they hate this kind of abstract notion of a person, because they don't, I mean, I would venture to say, I haven't read the book that you're referring to, but I'd venture to say up until this point, they probably hadn't had a conversation with a black person, right? They probably hadn't engaged or had any type of friendship on any level, because
Right.
they're part of what they're in the midst of, other than, of course, the Klan, they're in the midst of segregation. And part of what segregation did in the Jim Crow South, right, is everybody, the separate everything, the separate restaurants and the separate schools and the separate places on the bus and the train and so forth. And so segregation, our history with it, and what we tend to know about it is, of course, racial segregation, but there's all kinds of ways to segregate. And when you're segregated and just in this circle or this bubble of just people like you, right, then what it is you think you hate is just
your religion, or
Yeah.
your politics, I mean, your particular ethnic group, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people self-select into different areas. Yeah.
all of the isms, right? Whether it's racism, sexism, all of the isms. The homophobia is not an ism, right? I can't say,
Well,
I can call it homophobia though, because it's not an ism for it.
But
you
people
get
do
my
that,
point. All of them, and there can be certainly religious, and I mean, there's a long list of different types of discrimination, including, as I mentioned with you, even a political discrimination, right? Since there's not a word for it yet, I've sort of called it, or I call it, diversity phobia, right? And
exactly.
it's
People do that.
And it allows us to just sort of, and not just hate that other, whatever that other is that's different, right? And kind of foreign to us and what we know in our little upbringing and bubble. But it's also, then it's scary too, right? Then it's scary because, oh my gosh, this person and his or her religion or his or her sexual orientation or his or her, right? Like, then we can kind of be afraid of what we don't know as well. I mean, all of the experts, I think, I can't say all of them, I don't like speaking in such general terms, but a lot of experts will tell you that those isms and those phobias and that bigotry, it's rooted in ignorance. And that's one of the things that we plan on exposing, right, and making better. Is we don't want to be stuck in some place of ignorance, and that's what the echo chambers and the divisiveness does.
Right. Yeah. And there's just so much of that. You made me think of a
Would I be able to interject here?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Lyra. I'm the producer of Cancelled. I'll pop in from time to time, being a faceless, disembodied voice to interject in the discussion. But I'm already envisioning one of the ways someone could come at this discussion and say, yeah, well, you're kind of actually talking about normalizing these bad views from certain people in this really naive idea of, why don't we all just get along and just hold hands and be happy together? I know both of you on a more personal level now. I've heard these arguments before from both of you, so I know that you don't necessarily believe exactly that. There are certain people that even when you break it down and you talk about this is the logical conclusion of this idea, there are people that will turn around and say, yeah, so I don't care about those people. I don't care that this would hurt this person or this group of people. That, if we get to that point, I think we can all agree that's actually a bad person. Like, if you have someone that is genuinely being malicious and just does not care about certain people, then I feel like we can all agree, like, yeah, that's bad. That is probably someone we can all feel comfortable excising from the discussion.
Oh, well, and that again gets back to the author I was thinking it was Daryl Davis. If anyone's interested, the book is Clandestine Relations, spelled with a K. The person who is going to double down on that hate over and over again and never let go, holy shit, yes. I mean, one of the things that I want to, I guess, clarify to your point there, Lyra, and one of the things that I guess can puncture the bubble of supposed utopian idealism in this kind of discussion is that I want to approach these things by making strong arguments. And I think that's one of the ways Melissa made a point earlier on about compromise. And I'll make this point a number of times as we move along. I don't think that compromise is like, let's all like meet in the middle per se. I think that it has to involve taking much stronger positions, and then the middle can sort of naturally fall into place. I mean, honestly, we forget that a lot of what we got with the New Deal era, I mean, the whole FDR to LBJ, when there's a whole bunch of different programs and they're trying to actually tackle big problems, those things happened because we had very strong left populist and socialist movements still in this country. And there were those alternatives, and they didn't want that. So they actually met in what is closer to the middle. Today, when you talk about meet in the middle between Republicans and Democrats, you're basically still staying within the same. There's no real difference. There's not much of a difference between them. And I think that's a bad place to sort of negotiate, to kind of compromise there. I think we need to widen the discussions. I think we have broader discussions. And in doing that, just in general with people, if somebody has a genuinely bad idea, I'm going to come at that idea hard. And I'm going to say, this is why it's a bad idea. I'm going to lay out arguments for it and try to engage. But I think that there's a difference, again, between attacking the idea as genuinely horrible and immediately dismissing the person who had that idea. I mean, yeah, but if somebody is not going to be open to something, if somebody is always going to stay closed off to them, then yeah, you don't want to normalize or rationalize this kind of stuff. Again, I explicitly study things like fascism because I am an anti-fascist. I know the danger of these things, and if you normalize extremist views like that, it has really horrifying consequences. But they become normalized because we stopped engaging in the arguments, because we stopped reaching to them and saying, look, why the fuck do you believe this? And here's some better ideas.
Yeah, and I agree. There's some people that just are beyond reaching, and that's fine. I think you know when you get there. But I also think that those people, however many there are out there, I couldn't quantify it off the cuff, of course, but I think they're a much smaller number compared to what it would appear with the way we just proceed in this kind of growing partisan divide. So as much as I agree, there's no utopia, and I think all of us involved, and anybody probably who is choosing to listen, I mean, we're beyond that kind of rainbows and butterflies, thinking that there's some place of utopia that we'll reach, but to sort of be a little idealistic and reach for something better than what we have seen now or what we're looking at now is a good thing. And I know that that's part of why we're all involved in this project.
Yeah, I can give you just a personal one for me. I mean, I'm easily triggered by anti-Semitism. It's sort of a hot button issue for me. The arguments really tear at me, and Even so, even given that emotional response to it, I can point out that there's a difference between somebody who falls for an anti-Semitic argument and a committed anti-Semite.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who is self-consciously aware that they think in terms of these different racial categories and that Jews are inherently a defective bloodline that must be wiped out. Somebody who is explicitly pro-genocide, fuck that person. There's no reaching that person, and there's no reason to have a productive dialogue because they're not going to change their minds. But there are plenty of people, and there's a ton of them out there in politics today who fall for explicitly anti-Semitic dog whistles and arguments. I mean, tons of arguments about the globalists. I mean, like, Alex Jones fulminating about globalism, or all this cultural Marxism stuff, and they forget just how much of this actually has its origins in explicitly anti-Semitic tropes. And you can fall for a lot of those that rhetoric without realizing what you're doing. And I think if we just shut out and don't engage and help people to understand, no, this is a bad idea and it leads to this horrifying place, then you leave them to fall down that rabbit hole. And that's how they become those irredeemable people. So I guess that'd be my approach there. I'm not going to, I completely acknowledge, yes, you're not going to reach everybody, and you shouldn't. There's no reason to continue to beat your head against the wall indefinitely with somebody there. But I think that if we stop having discussions socially at all, we leave more people to end up like that. Just, unless, Alira had another one there. There was something that you had brought up a minute ago, Melissa, just this whole idea of, well, it made me think of the factionalism people fall into, the way we sort of divide against each other, and oftentimes it's even within people that really should agree on most things. I mean, there's a bazillion and one jokes about, like, working with leftists is like herding cats. It's like they immediately will break into different groups and hate each other over the tiniest things, and will fight over everything, and there's an element of truth to that. People have a hard time overlooking any kind of minor differences, and we do tend to self-select. And I think the more that happens, the worse things really can get, and it does lead to a basic kind of blindness that we're developing as a society as a whole. Another word that you used, the question of segregation, and you're thinking about classic segregation, Jim Crow, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out for people who don't know this, when we were actively trying to roll back segregation across the 50s and 60s and actually making progress, since about 1970, it's been going in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
We are today more segregated than we were in 1970. And people think, oh, segregation's all in the past, it's all gone, because what's gone is the specific law that says this is a coloreds-only drinking fountain. That's gone. But our neighborhoods, our schools, our churches, everything is so much more segregated than it was. And we have to look at some of the deeper reasons for that. Some of it really it's economic, that people are being priced out of certain areas. In fact, the black-white wealth gap has doubled since the 60s, which continually offends me. But some of it really does have to do with a lot of the cultural self-selection, too. We keep falling into groups of more like people, and that's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, even if you don't have the state architecture telling you can't interact, if you're choosing not to, I mean, God, who was it? There was somebody who just got called out in the Senate. Was it, what's his name, from Connecticut, I think? One of the senators just got called out for belonging to like a whites-only country club. And it's not whites-only in the sense that non-white people can't be members. It's whites only because it's a private country club, and the only way to become a member is to be invited by an existing member. And it just so happens that all of those people only know other rich white people. So go figure, you're hanging out with nothing but other rich white people. That's a really dangerous kind of segregation too. And it does have some pretty awful consequences. They didn't need to hang a sign up that says whites only to accomplish exactly the same goal.
Yeah, and exactly. That's why when I teach American government and we cover in my class social movements And it's a 100 level class when I teach it. So it's a survey course, and there isn't time really to dig too deeply. But when we get to social movements, I do tend to hammer home just as something for them to think about the power of law versus the power of social norms. And we take a look at that. And one of the things that I tend to kind of pose as food for thought is, yes, there's a lot of power in changing law. And when we look at any specific social movement, we see that there's always been interest groups and activists working hard to change the law, right? Whether it's for women's suffrage and extending voting rights to women, or even with gay marriage and legalizing or doing away with any kind of prohibition for same-sex marriage. The law matters and it's powerful, but there's really nothing, in my opinion, there's nothing quite more powerful or effective in changing social norms, right? Good or bad, one way or the other, because it's very powerful. So just as you said in the country club, there isn't, of course, any kind of law or policy within the private country club that prohibits any other race, blacks or any other type of race, any kind of racial prohibition, of course. But if the net result is the same, then I think that is important to examine. And I think when the law does change, that's great. And I wouldn't argue for any other type of law. I wouldn't argue for legalized discrimination, of course. But I think one of the challenges, though, is that when the law changes, that's a great triumph from the perspective of the minority or the social movement or whatever they're socially is being tackled. But then the sort of concern or problem that may come into play is that now it becomes in some ways more challenging to tackle the discrimination, because it's so easy for everyone to kind of look around and say, hey, look, there's no laws, there's no policy, there's no reason. Anybody who wants to join our club is welcome, and we're not, right? And so it makes things socially, for social progress, it can be challenging. And it's just another reason why, of course, diversity is good, and these kind of conversations are important, because otherwise you don't know what you don't know. And so if somebody isn't challenging you, and hopefully it's going to be in a respectful manner, but if somebody isn't challenging you on maybe examining that and why there isn't a single black person or a single person of color in your country club, then it's never going, then how's it going to ever change? I mean, it's that conversation that needs to take place.
Yeah, I run into that all the time.
Idealistic that sounds.
You see that, no. And honestly, as long as it's tempered by, experience and a bit of realism, I mean, idealism is a really good thing to have. I think we need more of it in society, not less. I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head in a couple ways here. Because I run into this problem all the time when people on both left and right who will make the argument, and I get this tons of times from so-called conservatives who will say, well, there's no law that says such and such is the case, so of course there's no sexism, there's no wage gap, there's no racism, it isn't there because the laws were changed. Well, that doesn't change the things. And you run into the same kind of thing with a bit of willful blindness sometimes with liberals too, because they think, well, we already solved this problem and it doesn't matter that I'm in this whites-only country club. It just doesn't occur to you. It's not the same reasoning, I guess. It's not the same force rationalizing, but the consequence is exactly the same. It leads to a kind of willful blindness. Changes to the laws are important, but they're not a panacea. And one thing that, and I realize I never talked a little bit about what I do for a living, so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds there, and this is a great segue to that, because I'm a cultural historian. I'm a historian of ideas and of cultures. And one thing that I try to make clear to people in all of my classes is that cultures change much more slowly than laws or societies or political systems or anything else can. It's one of the reasons oftentimes revolutions can founder, because they'll set out really good ideals or whatever and they'll start doing them, but there's always a backlash because people don't get it. They haven't adapted to the new idea yet, so they end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They end up rejecting the new changes. There's always a kind of like a back and forth, a kind of push and pull, between the more progressive liberal sort of mentality and the conservative that pulls you back a little bit there. And that pullback really is a fundamental part of why cultures change so slowly. And it's just part of who we are, really, as a species. As societies, always there's that back and forth between the two. And because it's there, because we adapt more slowly culturally, we have to be aware of that and reach out to people. Because we have to change hearts and minds. You can't just change the law and expect the problem is solved. Until people get it, until they experience it, until they feel it, until they know what it really is, it just isn't a thing for them. You can stay completely oblivious to it. How many times do we see somebody that's out there like, some kind of hardcore anti-LGBT politician, and then their son or daughter comes out as gay, and next thing you know, oh, well, I'm for gay marriage now. It's totally cool, because they were forced to actually have a conversation about it and to deal with the normality of it. And that simple lack of exposure often, it has consequences that we need to take seriously, and if we shut people out, it slows down that cultural evolution. It doesn't speed it up. Anyway, so I also teach.
Yes.
An educational background. I'm a history professor, and my field, is like I said, intellectual and cultural history. My teaching areas are like the Middle East and Europe and whatnot. I do a lot of and a number of like specialized sort of classes there, but the kind of approach overall is, for me, looking at the long-term historical changes. One of the things that I think is always particularly fascinated me, and one of the things that drew me into what I specifically do, is how some ideas just stick around for ages and ages and have like impacts. Like I literally straddle the line between studies of the ancient world and studies of the modern world, because I'm fascinated by just how old some of our conceptions are and how you can trace them back through these different successive stages of evolution. And I think that's one of the things that just teaches me, I guess, to be by nature a little bit more patient about social change and cultural change, is just seeing that it does always get better. No matter how upset you are about a particular fight and how much it affects you, and I'm absolutely going to be sympathetic and right there with you, and I will fight against this injustice with you, brother or sister, but I'm also going to be that annoying kind of like silver linings person and say, it's going to get better, because it kind of always does. It takes a long time, because humans are kind of like that. we have this as a flaw. It is part of who we are. And I think that I guess makes it a little, I don't know, it makes it more interesting for me to get involved in a lot of these discussions, and a lot of issues around social justice, just because I can see that it keeps working out, that we keep being people keep being on the right side of things, they keep pushing the envelope forward things, and go figure, it always gets better. Every single time. I don't know how many times you've seen, like, the sky will fall if we do this.
Right.
Like, oh my God, if we tolerate that, like, if we let the gays have rights, then the earth will swallow us up and God will kill us all. Like, hey, look, it didn't happen,
And as a historian, exactly. And as much as I don't dig nearly as deeply as you into history, but I certainly respect it, and I value it. And there's some real practical importance to it, including what you just stated. You can probably point to any part in world history. I'm much more familiar with U.S. history, but you could probably point to any part in world history and see that when some kind of change occurred, some kind of social change occurred, and then it was the end of the world, right? But then it wasn't, though, is the point.
Right.
And
yeah,
when
exactly.
you look at U.S. history, you see that same kind of sentiment. You can see going back to the filibuster, I think it was Strom Thurmond, right, that holds the record of filibustering at 24 hours, I think, and some change over the Civil Rights Act, not the 1964 one, because he was successful in his filibuster. So it was
he had a piss bucket on the Senate floor.
Yeah, legend has it, right? I like to share those parts in class, because then when students are asleep, it tends to get their attention. Yeah. But right, so here he was filibustering 24 hours and some change, one of the early versions of the Civil Rights Act before the 1964 one finally ended up passing. But whatever the argument was, when you look at U.S. history, U.S. political history, whatever argument that the politicians and whatever side they happen to be on came up with, it was always some kind of, the world's about to end. And then here we are, right, 2021, and so far, anyhow, the world hasn't ended. So
and life is actually better for most people. I mean, this is one of the things that's sort of funny. You get this a lot with people that they might have a casual interest in history, but they don't really get it. And you get this whole, like, back in the good old days kind of golden age sort of
right,
myth. And I'm like,
that, right.
The people would die at like 40, right? Of
in
like completely preventable illnesses, and that there were like rivers of human feces running down the middle of the street, and like, it just, life is so much better now.
And that's part of the accurate information, kind of knowing your history, even if you don't know what happened in 20 BC or however far back you study, but knowing your history reasonably and then applying it to your positions today, your choices today, like that's good stuff, because then you can kind of process through and realize that, just because something happened that maybe you don't exactly agree, or maybe you wouldn't have voted that way if you were in the Senate, right? But you can look back and see that the world didn't end on this instance or this instance or this instance or this instance, and yeah, things are better, and we have longer lifespans, and right, as a whole, we've made progress. We're smarter, healthier, ideally, right? So it helps you, I would say, among one of the many great things that comes from having these conversations, understanding your history, listening to different perspectives, is it helps you have better perspective with what's going on right now. And and that it's going to be okay.
And I think that we talk a lot about how people do need to learn from history. I mean, how many times do you hear somebody say some variation on, like, we keep repeating history or this or that, I mean, it's not that history works in cycles or something like that, or it actually repeats, but if you put people in similar circumstances, we do tend to make the same kind of mistakes. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the historian's curse, is to recognize those, because we can see the patterns unfolding and realize, okay, this is going to go badly, but you can't reach anyone on it. And I think one of the problems there, one of the things that makes it hard to learn from history, is that we still approach it badly. We still don't frame things wrong. Because, okay, so I'm going to make a statement that will sound worse than it is, especially to anybody watching here who might be a bit conservative, right? In the end, conservatives keep being wrong, like over and over and over and over again. But that doesn't mean that somebody is somehow wrong for having the perspective in the first place. It means that the world didn't end because things changed, right? The issue here is people will often look at that and they'll say, look, hey, the world didn't end when we gave women the right to vote, blah, blah, blah. Like, we didn't like blow ourselves up because of this, that, or the other thing. So you were wrong, and therefore conservatives are dumb. And that makes it impossible actually to deal with this, to actually learn from it, because all you're doing is you give someone a reason to tune you out. Mm-hmm. Because the commitment to that idea, the commitment to being worried about the consequences of change, that's actually, totally normal and honestly honorable as a perspective. I mean, the basic progress-oriented liberal perspective and the let's slow down change and pass on values to our kids ideals, they co-evolved a couple million years ago when we were wandering around the savannas of East Africa. They worked within the context of these hunter-gatherer societies. They both served an interesting function in holding the band together. And because they evolved in that specific context, we're sort of stuck with them. Our brains haven't changed at all in almost 300,000 years, and they changed relatively little over hundreds of thousands of years before that. We're not fundamentally very different. So we have that legacy in us, the basic impulse. And that's not going to change. The ideas, the arguments, the specific commitment somebody have, a particular ideology, a particular terrible idea somebody may have, those we can discuss. But you're not going to make somebody that's thoroughly committed on an emotional level to a very conservative or a very liberal perspective, they don't generally flip completely.
Mm-hmm.
It's very rare to have those kind of changes, and more often that's a matter of somebody having been more influenced by a particular environment, but actually being inclined in the other direction anyway. I mean, those differences, they're fine. They are what they are. It
Right.
makes it hard for us to learn from history if we assume that a person is somehow stupid because they're liberal or they're conservative, rather than addressing things in the context of bad ideas or policies and how
Mm-hmm.
can we find a different way to discuss this issue.
Yes, well, I'm happy to say we agree on that, because I know, I know, even though we haven't covered a lot of various points in just the last hour, we have off camera discussed quite a bit, and we disagree more than we agree, but that's okay, because our goal here is to model civic health, right?
Isn't that always the point? And that's honestly something. I mean, and I guess we've been rambling on for about an hour or so. So
I think so.
the one point that I guess we can just make here is that we should be able to have strong disagreements, and that's good. It's actually healthy, and this is where again, somebody shouldn't think that just having conversations with people somehow means you have to agree with them or accept or normalize a particular set of ideas. You're having a discussion because that's the only way we actually survive as a species. It's the only way we actually make any progress or change. The problem doesn't go away because you ignored it. And go figure, maybe somewhere along the way, your own views might change for the engagement, but you never know until you do it. But even if you're at the end still kind of convinced this person is wrong, having that conversation is so important still.
Yeah, and what you just said, by ignoring it, it doesn't go away, ever. And by berating the other person, it doesn't fix anything, ever either. So part of, and that's why I like kind of mixing taking a pragmatic approach with idealism. I like kind of blending the two, because I believe that I think we just should. Like, what's the point of life if we're not just striving for more and reaching for better?
Mm-hmm.
And if some of it falls in the category of idealism, that's okay, because at least you gave it your best shot, and whatever happens after that, like, it's not on you, it's not on me, right? But I like the practical part of just recognizing certain basics, or what should be basics, no-brainers, that if you and I are trying to have a conversation, and whatever the purposes of this conversation, if I start personally attacking you and calling you an idiot or calling you names and making it personal, then we've already finished before it even started. And so if you kind of expand that on a social level, on a political level, then what are you going to accomplish? I mean, you can still dislike that person, right? It's your prerogative. You can dislike that person, but to just resort to, and this goes back to what you said about learning kids, right? Sticks and stones, and what you said about the lessons we learn as kids, but resorting to name calling, other than it being immature and petty and toxic, it just will never accomplish anything. And there's no guarantee, conversely, that a healthy civic conversation it doesn't mean that we're going to solve all the problems of the world, right? But it's just, that's our best chance. And if you just resort to this immature kind of dumb behavior and start calling names, then for sure the walls come up, the enemy, right? The enemy lines are formed, and we're screwed. And it's not how it has to be.
Right, we just dig our heels in. People will get defensive. Honestly, somebody might not even be very committed to an idea. They might have just heard this cool thing, but they say something and somebody immediately attacks them on it. You're going to dig your heels in. Next thing you know, you're defending that idea. Next thing you know, you've fallen completely into it. We make things often worse by making them personal like that. And if we can find a way to defang that a little bit.
And do we want to discuss how we both ended up canceled by the Democratic Party, or do you want to save that for episode 2?
No, we can talk about those at some point there. Honestly, it's not really. It's more up to you. I honestly, I don't think it's all that important. I think that the idea of people being shut out without trying to understand where they were coming from or what they were doing is a problem just in general, and I think that that's sort of going to be implied sort of throughout this, but
Well, it definitely, our respective experiences, whether we choose to share them or not. I mean, it not only is part of how we ultimately came together for this project, but it's one, it's not the only piece, but it's definitely a big contributing piece to our current political system, to that current divide, because we see it modeled on all levels of government and within the parties that actively their whole purpose is to get candidates elected and to get elected officials reelected. And that's the purpose they serve as political parties. And yet we have firsthand experience with what they've modeled and how it's counterproductive on 1,000 different levels.
right.
So.
And I guess, and for me, I'm kind of a critic of tribalism and just, that whole partisan approach to begin with. But I kind of came into that already disliking the idea of it and knowing that it is a kind of a complicated environment there. But it's one of the things that bothers me about all the discussions there about canceling and cancel culture and all that is the degree to which people actually think it's a political issue at all, and not just an actual a larger social problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, canceling has been the absolute norm on the right and among conservatives for countless ages. So to see conservatives saying you should not cancel, like, weren't you the people calling and complaining to, the FCC whenever somebody said a dirty word on television or something? Like, and try to, I mean, there's always that attempt to try and like push out what you don't like. It's always existed on both sides and in both parties. To make it an issue that only liberals do this, only conservatives do this, or whatever there, kind of misses the point that we've fallen into an extremely tribalistic and toxic political culture that makes people jump immediately to conclusions and to dismiss people rather than talking about the ideas. And it makes it harder, too, to function just as a society, too, because our parties, especially with our lousy voting system, we're stuck with a two-party system, they're inevitably big, complex, diverse environments anyway. And when the right is pushing out anybody who doesn't love Trump, and the left is pushing out anybody who's slightly conservative or this or that, and it just, how does this help anybody to actually find ways to bridge differences or to talk? So.
Right, and it doesn't. And so certainly throughout our episodes, right, our discussions, we are going to take a look at that, because it's we can certainly own it and be responsible for it, but it's modeled everywhere from local government all the way up to the United States Congress, and certainly we've had our firsthand experience with it, and so those things need to be looked at, and I personally think they need to sometimes be called out when appropriate, and that's part of what I think we'll accomplish here.
Yeah, and I'd agree, and I think that we should do an episode on just canceling as an idea at some point.
Yes,
and we can sort of plan to do that as like a whole specific thing, and in that we can talk about our own experiences, and we can talk about party politics, and we can also take, I'll bring in a little bit of a historical view of that too, of just how this dynamic has worked, and some of the dangers in it. People should be able to be forced to take accountability for mistakes and then learn and grow from those mistakes. And we seem to be eliminating that possibility of both disagreement and of mistakes in society. So I think that we share a sort of antipathy to that as an idea, and also agree that people should be held to account and should be called out for things. That this is, again, oftentimes when people are complaining about canceling, they're basically just saying, hi, I want the freedom to be an asshole with no consequences. And that's not remotely a perspective that I will ever advance here, because if someone does something wrong, if I do something wrong, please, if I do something wrong, tell me I'm doing something wrong, because that's how I get better as a human being.
That's
if you
how
don't
we all
tell me,
get
I
better.
don't know.
Right. That's how we all get better as human beings.
Exactly. And I think that, some levels of I don't know, some amount of of shame or whatever is healthy in a society. I don't think that itself is a problem. But I think that it interacts badly with the tribalism that we've fallen into. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we should definitely come back to it as a topic.
What else are we going to discuss? I know we're going to talk about cancel culture. We're going to pick apart the parties. We for sure need to discuss, and you've already used it quite a bit, I think, over the last hour or so. We need to discuss some of these words, right? I know neo-fascism is a word that you use all the time. It's a hashtag you use a lot. And we need to kind of dig into some of that, because you mentioned that at some point people catch these political talking points and mom and dad says this, or they go to church and they hear that. And oftentimes they will repeat, right? They'll repeat these terms and not even really know what they're saying, not even really know the meaning behind them. So I think that we'll incorporate some vocabulary in our discussions, because that's important and tends right. I mean, this is right up our alley as educators.
Right. There's a pedagogical aspect to this, and honestly, we could do a fun one here. Because again, I actually will teach about political philosophies and whatnot, so I can prattle on about these things forever, but we could probably find more fun ways to do it. Maybe walk through some of those, the different ideology tests that are online, and talk about our answers to things, and and then use those as ways to talk about the different positions or something, or where we can just lay out a bunch of them, here are a dozen common political positions. It's not just we're all conservatives or liberals,
right.
I mean, there's a lot of different places you can fall. We can actually just make a list and walk through the differences and kind of plot the relationships, because I think that if we so many people, I could not tell you how many people I run into just in politics, in ordinary life, and in classrooms that think they're conservative and they're not, that think they're liberal and they're not. I mean, they honestly don't know enough what the word actually means,
or
but
even
they use the label.
Right, exactly. And because they catch these terms here and there and wherever, and they start to kind of repeat them, make these assumptions, even the fact that there's different parties, right? What's the Democrats and the Republicans what do they represent in general, or what's their general platforms? But what about the smaller political parties? And your average,
there's actually quite a few of them.
Your average kind of voter, or your average Joe, so to speak, isn't really even aware of the various options and ranked choice voting, which we have to talk about at some point, just because.
Yes, we should.
Wow, would that not make the world a better place if we could somehow push that through, or have some small influence on getting that idea to go and to build some momentum?
If I had my druthers, we'd change the entire voting system in the Constitution, but we can't do that. So ranked choice voting pushed through at the state levels accomplishes a lot of the same basic objectives. So
and
why
we can
not?
Walk through what that looks like too, in order to amend the Constitution.
Yeah,
exactly. In the Constitution, that's quite ambitious to make any sort of amendments to that. But ranked choice voting is something that could realistically happen. We've got the power. The states have the power to implement it. So we need to just
states control the elections technically
about that. Yeah. There's so much.
There's a ton of things that we can do. Yeah, there's a ton of topics that we can hit. We'll touch on definitely some hot button issues. Some things that people like to complain about. Oh gosh, there's a big one right now that's come up a lot, like the whole critical race theory that people have suddenly assumed that the high school is brainwashing my kid. We should talk about that.
We should.
There's a lot of issues we can tackle here, but also a lot of just good kind of uplifting pedagogical things where we can talk a bit more about American government. You teach American government, I teach international politics and political philosophy. Let's talk about these things and help people to understand more who they really are. Because if we're going to reach across to people,
we will raise the civic health, right? That's what we're going to do, is raise our country's civic health. I know that's hugely ambitious, but we'll just start with maybe the 7 people that will watch us.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, people often forget that, everything we do makes a difference. Your conversation around the water cooler, makes a difference.
It does.
And we tend to assume that we have no real power to change the world. That a revolution is something somebody else does.
Margaret Mead, I would think you're familiar with her as a, right? She's was a cultural anthropologist, but
Right.
I'm big on quotes. I think that's a professor thing, right? I'm big on quotes, and I have a bunch of quotes, of course, on my syllabus and on my refrigerator and written down on pieces of paper everywhere, magnets randomly. But to quote Margaret Mead, never doubt a small group of committed citizens can change the world, right? Because it's the only thing that ever has.
Right.
I love that one.
Yeah. And we tend to forget the power of organizing, the power of conversations, just the power of random acts of kindness in our own lives literally do change the world for the better. So, I mean, that's where, I don't know, my idealism is definitely going to come through in this. I think your idealism is going to come through in this. And when hopefully anybody watching realizes we're not terrible people.
And then Lyra will check us when our idealism gets out of hand, right?
Right. And I love that, actually, being able to pop in with like, well, somebody could make this reasonable criticism of what you're saying. Oh, please do that. It'll make things so much better here. And one of the things we want to try and do, too, and I think it's useful to point out before we get to the end here, what we want to try and do with these is be able to engage with people, too, who are watching. Be able to engage with people who are watching this on, like, Twitch or YouTube or whatever, and engage in the chats and have conversations. So what we'll try to do when I'm streaming this is actually I'll pop in and being able to engage there, and your questions, your criticisms, your ideas can inform something we'll bring up next time around. You might have a really good point that, hey, we didn't think about discussing that. We'll bring it in and we'll talk about it next time around. So
yes,
please
we will.
Get involved,
Please. Let's make the world a better place together.
Thank you. All right, so again, I'm Liam O'Mara,
And I'm Melissa Bourbonnais.
And this was Cancelled, and we'll hope to see you next week.